This is the Magic Treehouse Research Guide, Mummies and Pyramids, a nonfiction companion to Mummies in the Morning by Will Osborne and Mary Pope Osborne. Dear readers, we came back from our adventure in Mummies in the Morning with lots of questions. Why did people make mummies? What was written in the Book of the Dead? How did ordinary people in ancient Egypt live? We didn't go back to ancient Egypt to find the answers. We didn't even leave Frog Creek. We did research. We started at the library. We found books about pyramids and mummies and a video about Egyptian people. Then we checked the internet. We found a site that told us more about ancient Egyptian writing. We took lots of notes, and Jack drew a picture of a mummy's tomb. Later, we watched a show on television about finding the tomb of a mummy called King Tut. In this book, we're going to share our research with you, so get your notebook, get your backpack, and get ready to travel back 5,000 years to learn all about mummies and pyramids. Jack and Annie. Chapter 1, Ancient Egypt. For thousands of years, mummies and pyramids were a great mystery. How were the pyramids built? Why did people make mummies? What was the strange writing on the mummy cases? In the last 200 years, scientists have learned a great deal about the people who built the pyramids and made mummies. They were a hard-working people who enjoyed life. They loved science and music. They believed in a sun god and a cat goddess. They thought they could live forever. They were the people of ancient Egypt. Egypt is where one of the oldest civilizations in the world began. 5,000 years ago, Egyptians invented one of the first forms of writing. They made a kind of paper from reed plants. They invented a calendar much like the ones we use today. The ancient Egyptians built some of the most amazing buildings in the world that the world has ever known. Their painters and sculptors created beautiful works of art. Their doctors went to school to study how the body works. Why did such a great civilization begin in Egypt so long ago? Most historians think the answer is simple: the Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in the world. It flows through the middle of Egypt. The Nile gave the ancient Egyptians water for drinking and bathing. Egyptian fishermen caught many kinds of fish in the Nile. Hunters hunted wild birds along its banks. Boats sailed up and down the Nile, carrying people and goods. But the Nile's greatest gift to the Egyptians wasn't fish or birds or drinking water or travel. It was mud, floods, and farming. Most of the land in Egypt is part of the Sahara Desert. Desert soil is sandy and rocky. It is not good for farming. The ancient Egyptians called the desert the Red Land. No one lived in the Red Land. Hardly anything could grow there. The land along the banks of the Nile was very different from the Red Land. The soil there was dark and soft. The Egyptians called this land the Black Land. The Black Land was some of the best farmland in the world. Why was the Black Land so good for farming? Every July, the Nile flooded its banks. The floodwater dumped a layer of black mud along each side of the river. The black mud was very fertile. That means it is full of things that plants need to grow. In November, the floodwaters went down. Farmers plowed the black land. They planted seeds in the rich, fertile soil. In March, they harvested their crops. The harvest was almost always very plentiful. That means there was more than enough food for everyone. Farm year: July, flooding. November, planting. March, harvesting. Two kingdoms. Villages formed near the good farmland along the Nile. Some of the villages became cities. Over time, the villages and cities became part of two separate kingdoms. For many years, each kingdom had a different king. One king ruled over the land in the north while the Nile flows into the sea. The other king ruled over the land in the south along the Nile Valley. About 5,000 years ago, a king named Menes united the two kingdoms. King Menes built a capital city close to where the separate kingdoms had met. He wore a special crown. It was the crowns of both kingdoms. Most historians say that the joining of two kingdoms was the beginning of the great Egyptian nation. When King Menes put on his double crown, he started a civilization that lasted for 3,000 years. Turn the page to learn about the ancient Egyptian alphabet this way. Hieroglyphic Writing. The ancient Egyptians wrote in pictures. Their picture writing is called hieroglyphic writing. The pictures were mostly of things from everyday life: owl, water, basket. But the pictures did not always stand for the thing that they showed: duck, sun, Most Egyptians never learned to read hieroglyphs. There were over 700 different signs. Chapter 2, Everyday Life. Most ancient Egyptians were farmers. They lived in villages and towns in their black land along the Nile River. Their houses were made of mud bricks. The mud for the bricks was another gift of the Nile. Even wealthy people lived in houses that were very close to each other. That's because Egyptians wanted to save most of the black land for farming. Egyptian houses usually had high, flat roofs. Families often did their cooking on the roof. They sometimes slept on the roof in the summer. Poor families' house usually only had one room. Wealthy Egyptians had larger houses. They had servants to do their cooking, washing, and other chores. If you could peek beneath the roof of an Egyptian house, this is what you might see. Most Egyptians did not have a lot of furniture. Their houses only had a few stools, small tables, and floor mats. Walls were painted bright colors. Ceilings were high to keep the house cool. Egyptians slept on beds made of wood and reeds. They rested their heads on headrests. The headrests were usually carved from wood. Egypt has a very warm climate. Most ancient Egyptians hardly ever wore shoes. Their clothing was mostly white and loose-fitting. Almost all their clothes were made of linen. Linen is a cloth made from flax plants. Ancient Egyptians cared a great deal about how they looked. Wealthy Egyptian men and women both wore eye makeup and wigs. They also wore necklaces, bracelets, and rings. Egyptians loved perfume. They liked to rub good-smelling oils and creams on their skin. Children and family life. Egyptologists believe that the ancient Egyptians loved children. Egyptian art often shows parents having fun with their sons and daughters. Yikes! Young children in Egypt didn't wear any clothes at all. Ew. Egyptian children played with spinning tops and balls. Both boys and girls played with dolls and wooden animals. Children and grown-ups also played board games. These games were sort of like checkers or chess. Tomb painting of an Egyptian queen playing a board game. Most children did not go to school. They lived with their parents until they were married. Egyptian boys and girls wore their hair in a style called side locks. Nobody knows why. The ancient Egyptians were some of the first people to keep animals as pets. The Egyptians loved their pets. They treated them like members of the family. One story says that when a family's pet cat died, the whole family shaved off their eyebrows to show their grief. Ew. Scribes. One of the most important jobs in ancient Egypt was that of a scribe. Scribes wrote on scrolls. These scrolls were made from a reed called papyrus. Scribes kept records for the government. They also kept records for merchants and traders. They copied down magic spells and scientific information. It took years of schooling to become a scribe. The hieroglyphic alphabet was very hard to learn. Most Egyptians never learned it at all. They hired scribes to read and write for them. Pharaohs. The rulers of Egypt lived very differently than ordinary people. They had hundreds of servants. Their homes were grand palaces. Egyptian rulers came to be called pharaohs. Pharaohs had total power over their people. Ancient Egyptians believed that the pharaoh controlled the weather, the flooding of the Nile, and the growth of the crops. Egyptians thought that their pharaoh was more than a person. They worshipped him as a god. Jack and Annie present the animals of ancient Egypt. Crocodiles, hippos, and beautiful birds lived along the Nile River. Lions, wild bulls, and jackals also lived in ancient Egypt. Egyptian statues and jewelry were often made to look like animals. This glass fish held perfume. This wooden goose sat on wooden eggs. This lion guarded a jar of face cream. This hippo was a good luck charm. Chapter 3, Egyptian Religion. Ancient Egyptians worshipped their pharaoh. They also worshipped many gods and goddesses. Egyptians pictured their gods and goddesses in several different ways. A few were like ordinary men and women. Some were like animals. Some were half human and half animal. The Egyptians believed the gods and goddesses watched over everything they did. Egyptian queen with falcon-headed god Horus. Temples. The Egyptians built great temples for their most important gods and goddesses. Inside the temples were sacred statues. Priests at the temples cared for the statues. They washed and dressed them. They even served them meals. Ordinary people were not allowed to see the sacred statues inside the temples. When they visited, they said prayers and left gifts outside. At home, they prayed to their own statues of their favorite gods and goddesses. The next life. An important part of Egyptian religion was the belief in next life. The next life was where people went after they died. They could enjoy many of the same things they had enjoyed on earth. Egyptians believed that every person was made up of 3 parts. The first part was the body. The second part was the ka. The ka was the person's life force. It was what made the person alive. The third part was called the ba. The ba was what made people different than anyone else. Egyptians believed that when a person died, the ba and the ka left the body. For the person to live in the next life, the ba and the ka had to come together again. Egyptians often showed the Ba as a bird with a human head. The body was home for the Ba and the Ka, so it was very important that the body of a dead person not be destroyed. To keep the body from being destroyed, the ancient Egyptians turned it into a mummy. Turn the page to learn more about the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. This way. Gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians worshipped many gods and goddesses. Here are some of the most important ones. Ra. Ra was the sun god. He was sometimes shown the body of a man and the head of a falcon. The Egyptians believed Ra created the world. They thought Ra sailed across the sky every day in a golden boat. At sunset, Ra sailed his boat into the underworld. The underworld was a kingdom beneath the earth. At sunrise, Ra rose from the underworld and sailed his boat across the sky again. Horace and Isis. Egyptians believed that long ago, Osiris and Isis had been the first king and queen of Egypt. When Osiris was murdered by his evil brother Isis, Isis used magic powers to bring him back to life. Osiris became god of the dead and ruler of the underworld. Isis became the goddess of healing, marriage, and motherhood. Horus. Horus was the son of Isis and Osiris. He was a falcon-headed god. Egyptians believed their pharaoh was Horus in human form. Bastet. Bastet was Ra's daughter. She was a cat goddess. She was shown as a cat or a human with a cat's head. Egyptians believed that Bastet had the sun's power to make their crops grow. They prayed to Bastet for a good harvest every year. Bastet was also the goddess of music and dance and the goddess of joy and love. Thoth. Thoth was a moon god. Egyptians believed that Thoth gave them the gift of writing. He was also the god of medicine and mathematics. He sometimes was shown as a baboon. He was also shown as a man with the head of a bird. Bes. Bes was one of the Egyptians' favorite gods. He was short, chubby, and happy. He had lion's ears and tail, and the body and the face of a man. Bes brought joy and good luck to families. He protected the whole household. Chapter 4. Mummies. Normally, when an animal or a person dies, the body begins to decay. That means that the skin, hair, muscles, and other part of the body start to rot away. Finally, there is nothing left but bones. A mummy is a dead body that has been protected from decay. The first Egyptian mummies were probably made by accident. The ancient Egyptians needed land near the Nile for farming, so they buried their dead in the nearby desert. The hot desert sand dried out the bodies very quickly. They didn't decay. They became mummies. The Egyptians studied these desert mummies. They learned from them how to protect the body for the next life. Making it a mummy. It took a long time to make a mummy. The work was done by a team of priests. Egyptians believed the god Anubis watched over mummy making. Anubis had the body of a man and the head of a jackal, so the chief priest wore a mask of a jackal. The place where the priests worked was called the Beautiful House. Everything in the Beautiful House was done with great care. First, all the organs except the heart were taken out of the body. The ancient Egyptians believed that the gods weighed a person's heart when he or she tried to enter the next life. The weight of the heart would tell the gods if the person had lived a good life on earth. Other organs were put into special jars to be buried with the mummy. Next, the priest washed the body with wine. They said prayers. They rubbed the body with oils and spices. Then the priest covered the body with a kind of salt called natron. Natron worked like the desert sand, only better. It helped dry the body even more quickly and keep it from decaying. Finally, the priest laid the body on a slanted table. They said more prayers, then they left the body to dry for 40 days. When the body had dried out, it was wrapped in strips of linen. The linen had been soaked in resin. As they dried, the linen strips became very hard. The priests wrapped magic charms in the mummy's linen strips. The Egyptians believed that these charms would bring good luck and protect the person in the next life. These priests wrapped and wrapped until the body was covered from head to toe. Sometimes a mask of the person's face was placed over the linen strips. This was to help Ba and Ka recognize the person underneath. When the body was fully wrapped, it was ready to be placed in its mummy case. There was usually a painting of the person's face on the mummy case too. Many mummy cases were decorated with paintings and writings. The painting often showed the person entering the next life and meeting the gods. The writing spelled out prayers and magic spells. Early mummy cases were rectangular boxes like this one. Later mummy cases were shaped more like the mummy inside. When the mummy was sealed inside the case, it was ready to be taken to its tomb. Amulets. The magic charms wrapped in the mummy's linen strips are called amulets. Some amulets were little statues of the gods. Others were symbols, like a set of stairs leading to the next life. Many amulets were in the shape of a beetle called a scarab. The Egyptians believed that each day at dawn, a giant scarab pushed the sun into the sky. Scarab amulets were a symbol of rebirth in the next life. They often had wings. Another very popular amulet is called the Eye of Horus. The Egyptians believed that the god Horus lost his eye in a fight with his evil uncle. It was magically put back by the god Thoth. Egyptians thought that the eyes of Horus painted on mummies' cases would allow mummies to see outside. Chapter 5, Egyptian Funerals. Egyptian funerals were very big events. They were meant to send the dead person safely into the next life. On the day that the mummy was taken to its tomb, families and friends formed a funeral procession. The funeral procession was sort of like a parade. The procession started at the dead person's home. It included family members, priests, friends, and servants. It was important to have a lot of people in the funeral procession. The dead person's family sometimes paid people to walk with them and to mourn the person's death. These people might not have even known the person in life, but they would scream and cry and throw dust on themselves to show their grief. If they did an especially good job of acting sad, they would be paid even more. The people in the funeral procession brought things that they thought the dead person would need in the next life. They carried food and drink, weapons, tools, and musical instruments. If the person being buried was a child, they might even bring toys. The funeral procession first went to the beautiful house. There, the mummy in its mummy case was placed on a wooden barge. Oxen dragged the barge across the desert to the place where the mummy was to be buried. As the procession crossed the sand, priests said prayers and recited magic spells. The ancient Egyptians believed it was important that everything be done right, or the person would never get into the next life. When the procession arrived at the tomb, there was a special ceremony. It was called the opening of the mouth. A priest said a prayer. Then he touched the mummy's mouth. The Egyptians believed that the opening of the mouth ceremony made it possible for the dead person to eat, drink, and speak in the next life. Finally, the mummy was ready to be laid in its tomb. Turn the page to learn about the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead. Ancient Egyptians believed that they would have to travel through the underworld to get to the next life. This journey was very dangerous. To help them make the journey safely, mummies were buried with prayers, magic spells, and maps of the underworld. These prayers and spells and maps were called the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead wasn't really a book. The spells and maps were written and drawn on papyrus scrolls. The Egyptians believed that if the dead person followed the directions in the Book of the Dead and passed all the tests of the gods, he or she would live happily forever in the next life. Chapter 6, The Age of the Pyramids. Early pharaohs and other wealthy Egyptians had burial tombs made of mud bricks. These tombs are called mastabas. Mastabas looked like very large benches. They had flat roofs and slanted sides. The mummy wasn't actually kept in the mastaba. It was buried underneath in a room called a burial chamber. Sometimes the burial chamber was as much as 80 feet below the mastaba. The first pyramid. The first pyramid was created by an Egyptian architect and priest named Imhotep. Imhotep's pharaoh was King Zoser. King Zoser wanted the most beautiful burial palace that had ever been built. So Imhotep planned a giant stone mastaba for King Zoser. It would be the largest mastaba in all Egypt. As the giant mastaba was being built, King Zoser decided that he wanted something even better. Imhotep didn't know what to do. He started to make the mastaba bigger. Then he got another idea. Imhotep decided to put a smaller mastaba on the top of the first one. He put another mastaba on top of that. Then another, then another. Finally, Zoser's burial place was a stack of 6 mastabas. Imhotep had created the first pyramid. Imhotep's pyramid was nearly 200 feet high. After he died, the Egyptians worshipped Imhotep as one of their gods. Imhotep's pyramid is called a step pyramid. It looks like a set of steps going up toward the sky. Step pyramids were built for several pharaohs who ruled after King Zoser. Then Egyptians began to build another kind of pyramid. The new kind of pyramid started as a step pyramid, but once it was built, the steps were filled in to make the sides smooth. Some people think that this smooth-sided pyramid was made to look like a ray of sunlight. It is the pyramid shape that we know best today. The Pyramids of Giza. The most famous Egyptian pyramids are the 3 smooth-sided Pyramids of Giza. They were built more than 4,500 years ago. All 3 are still standing today. The largest of the Giza pyramids is called the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid is nearly 500 feet tall. The Great Pyramid is the biggest stone building ever built. The Great Pyramid was built for a pharaoh named Khufu. In 1954, Egyptologists found a wooden boat buried near the Great Pyramid. The boat was over 140 feet long. They think it was probably the barge that led Khufu's funeral procession and carried his mummy to its tomb. Khufu's barge was made from over 650 pieces of wood. Building the pyramids. It took many years to build a pyramid. It also took thousands of workers. Egyptologists think the workers used wooden rollers to move the giant stones across the desert. Some of these stones weighed over 4,000 pounds. No one really knows exactly how the workers put the giant stones in place. Most Egyptologists think they built large ramps to raise the stones up the sides of the pyramids. When the pyramid was finished, the ramps were torn down. Many people think the work on the pyramids was done by slaves. This is not true. Almost all the work was done by farmers during the flood season. The farmers were paid to help build the pyramids, but most of them worked for a reason more important than money. They believed that building the pyramids would help them get to the next life when they died. The Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx guards the Pyramids of Giza. A sphinx is a make-believe creature with the body of a lion and the head of a hawk, a ram, or a person. The Jack Sphinx. The Great Sphinx has the body of a lion and the head of a pharaoh named Khafre. King Khafre's pyramid is next to the Great Pyramid of King Khufu. The Great Sphinx was carved from a rock mountain. It is a large statue from ancient times still standing today. Chapter 7. Tomb Treasures and Tomb Robbers. The ancient Egyptians wanted to be as comfortable and happy in the next life as they had been on earth, so they filled their tombs with everything they thought they might need. Mummies were buried with extra clothes and sandals, writing materials, and fans. Their families put makeup, wigs, combs, and mirrors in the tombs. They wanted the dead to look their best in the next life. Mummies were even buried with food and drink in the next life. Bread, beef, figs, and jugs of beer have been found in their tombs. Shabtis. Wealthy people wanted to have servants in the next life. Since they couldn't take their living servants with them, they made servant statues. These statues were called Shabtis. The Egyptians believed that the Shabtis would come to life and go to work in the next life. There were often other statues in the tomb too. Some of the statues of the dead person. The Egyptians believed that these statues would be a home for the Ba and Ka if the mummy were destroyed. Other statues were there to guard the mummy and protect it from evil. Tomb robbers. The items buried with mummies could be very valuable. Many amulets, statues, and mummy cases were partly made of gold. Some were decorated with jewels. The mummy's treasures were supposed to be used in the next life. But throughout history, many dishonest people have stolen the treasures to use in this life. These people are called tomb robbers. When tomb robbers broke into a tomb, they took everything of value. They showed no respect for the mummy or its sacred resting place. Tomb robbers broke open the mummy cases. They took the amulets from the mummy's linen strips. They stole jewelry from the mummy's body. They took the makeup and perfume and body oils that had been left for the mummy to use in the next life. Sometimes tomb robbers even burned the mummy to light the tomb while they worked. Tomb robbing was very dangerous. Ancient Egyptians thought tomb robbers were committing crimes against the gods. If they were caught, they were beaten and often put to death. Sadly, this did not stop others from robbing the mummy's tombs. Because of the tomb robbers' greed, many of the great treasures of ancient Egypt have been lost forever. Tomb paintings. One thing robbers couldn't steal was the art on the walls of the tombs. Tomb paintings have taught us a great deal about life in ancient Egypt. Tomb paintings often show people dancing or playing musical instruments. It was believed the dancers and musicians in the paintings would dance, sing, and play for the dead person in the next life. Tomb paintings often show the person who had died. Even if the person was old and weak at the time of death, tomb paintings show him as young and healthy. Egyptians believed that this is how the person would live in the next life. Chapter 8. The most famous mummy of all. Pyramids were built to honor pharaohs and their families, but pyramids often told tomb robbers exactly where to look for treasure. Pharaohs cared more about keeping their mummies safe than having huge pyramids, so they began to build secret tombs they hoped robbers couldn't find. The Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings is hidden deep in the Egyptian desert. It is surrounded by rocky cliffs with steep walls. There is a mountain near the Valley of the Kings that is shaped like a pyramid. The Egyptians thought that this would be a perfect place to hide the tombs of their pharaohs. The people who built tombs in the Valley of the Kings worked very hard to keep them hidden. They cut secret chambers into the rock. They dug passageways that led nowhere. They built false entrances. They sealed the real entrances with heavy stones. Guards watched the tombs day and night. Hidden tombs, secret chambers, fake passageways, false entrances, guards. Still, tomb robbers found the tombs and the treasures. More than 60 royal tombs were cut into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings. Tomb robbers found them all. The Boy King's Tomb. For many years, Egyptologists searched the Valley of the Kings for a tomb of a pharaoh named Tutankhamen. Tutankhamen is also called the Boy King. He became pharaoh when he was 9 years old. He died when he was only 18. Egyptologists knew from ancient writings that Tutankhamun's mummy had been buried in the Valley of the Kings, but for years no one had been able to find his tomb. One Egyptologist who worked very hard to find Tutankhamun's tomb was Howard Carter. He searched for more than 5 years. He was about to give up, but then he made a discovery. In 1922, Carter found some stone steps buried beneath the ruins of some ancient workers' huts. Could these be the steps to the Boy King's tomb? Carter and his team began to dig. The steps led to a door. Behind the door was a tunnel. They kept digging. Finally, Carter and his team came to what they thought would be the entrance to the tomb. Carter broke a hole in the door. He held a candle and peered through the hole. "What do you see?" called someone in Carter's team. "Wonderful things," said Carter. Carter saw gold everywhere when he looked. Gold statues, gold boxes, gold chairs. In another room, Carter found a huge stone sarcophagus. When he opened it, he found a mummy case. Inside was a second mummy case. Inside that was a third mummy case. The third mummy case was made of solid gold, and inside was the mummy of King Tutankhamen. It took Carter and his team nearly 10 years to study everything that was in Tutankhamun's tomb. The tomb had been broken into during ancient times, but very little had been stolen. The robbers probably had been caught before they got away with much. The tomb of Tutankhamen is the most famous mummy of all time. Tutankhamun's treasures have been seen by millions of people all over the world. They are now in a museum in Cairo, Egypt, and King Tutankhamun's mummy is resting safely back in its tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Turn the page to see some of the treasures of Tutankhamun. Jack and Annie present King Tut's Treasures. When Tutankhamun's treasures were shown in the museums in America, the pharaoh was nicknamed King Tut. Here are some of King Tut's treasure: ivory headrest, royal dagger, golden throne, game board. Chapter 9, Gifts of the Pyramids and Mummies. Each year, millions of tourists visit the ancient pyramids in Egypt. There are over 35 pyramids still standing along the banks of the Nile River. The pyramids are empty now. Their mummies and treasures are in museums all over the world. There they are treated with great care and respect. Finally, they are safe from tomb robbers. The mummies of Egypt have given us a great gift, the gift of knowledge. The writings, paintings, and treasures of the mummies' tombs teach us how the ancient Egyptians lived, how they worked, and how they played. This knowledge helps bring the distant past alive. The ancient Egyptians believed they could live forever. In a way, they have.